This is Family Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air for the first time with Ben Oofana. How you doing tonight?
Good, good, Phantom. Thank you for having me on here.
We want to let people know that we are a featured podcast on the Newsly Network. You can see below there's a coupon code, and that's for an audio version of the podcast. So if you want to check that out, use coupon code Ghost, and you can check that out tonight. We'll be, as I said, we are a featured podcast. The Family Electric Ghost podcast is on Newsly. And also, we have one of your links up, which is gettingoveryourbreakup.com. And then that will be fully clickable when we're published, as well as this other link that we have is refiningrelationships.com. That will also be fully clickable when we're published so people can, they don't have to remember. But I'll be alternating between those if people didn't catch that. But thank you again for being on the show. And we like to talk about topics, but I think one of the topics we were going to get into today was love's ashes, how heartbreak can give us a guide to deeper intimacy. But before we get into that, I like to ask people like, why do you do what you do? Is the first question.
One of the main reasons is because as I was growing into adulthood, the fact that I had suffered a lot of physical, emotional abuse, and like so many people who have experienced that and other forms of trauma and dysfunction in their upbringing with either their parents or their caregivers. And I feel for the most part that our parents, caregivers were doing the best they can for the most part with the understanding, the resources they possessed. But the fact that when we experienced a lot of this either abuse or neglect or other forms of dysfunction, as children and adolescents, we don't possess the resources or understanding that would enable us to process or digest these events and our subsequent emotional responses. That we have these very limited resources as children and adolescents. And so we internalize a lot of these either abuse or dysfunction, and it becomes so deeply ingrained in us. And as we grow into adulthood, we find ourselves reenacting a lot of these patterns in our adult, well, first adolescent and then adult intimate relationships. And so there's a lot of this emotional wounding that, in many respects, operates outside of our conscious waking awareness. We make it worse by the fact that we live in a society where we're taught to, in many ways, to deny, disconnect from our emotional wounding. We suppress a lot of our emotions, our emotional responses. And so this operates, again, outside of our conscious waking awareness. And so as we get into intimate relationships, as we begin to form attachments to individuals, we find ourselves desiring, wanting to be with one person or another. And yet, more than anything else, as we desire to be with someone, as we form an attachment, as we get into relationships, these individuals we form attachments to reflect back to us our deep emotional wounding. And when we're not understanding, when we're not cognizant of the patterns that we're enacting in our relationships, it often results in these, many instances, very heartrending dramas, patterns of abandonment, rejection, unrequited love, or we attract partners into our lives that often say and do things that are very hurtful. And if we can't process these things, these experiences and our subsequent emotional responses, a lot of what happens is it ends up reinforcing our existing emotional wounding. It can easily become long-standing patterns that continue to play out, often over many years. And yet, as we gain the much needed understanding, and for me, for instance, working with the practices and also discovering the therapeutic interventions that are essential for facilitating the healing of these deep emotional wounds, we can heal and transform these parts of ourselves. And we need to heal and transform these parts of ourselves because only as we do so can our relationships improve. We let go of the unhealthy attachments and we begin to attract into our lives companions through which we can learn, we can grow, which we can evolve ourselves, and subsequently our relationships evolve. And so as we come to understand these things and we incorporate these practices and interventions, it gives us these means through which we could utilize our relationships as a means to heal and evolve and transform. Does that all make sense?
It makes sense. It seems like though you would probably have to start, like if you have imposter syndrome, like if you don't love yourself, right? If you don't solve that, even though you might have all these traumas, if that was like the core source issue, is because you had these childhood traumas that were because of kind of a, self-fulfilling prophecy of, imposter syndrome, then what you end up doing is it's like law of attraction. You keep on attracting the same environment, same situation, same scenario, same people.
Yeah, and that's so important, exactly what you're saying here, because when we deny or disconnect from these emotions, there can be a whole range of subsequent emotional responses. We feel guilt. We feel that we're somehow damaged or defective. We feel anger and resentment, and it becomes directed towards ourselves. And that can further the destructive spiral that many of us unfortunately fall into. What I found is that when I was enacting these patterns in my own relationships or attempt to form relationships, is that the more that I could fully open up to these emotions, open to the full range of these emotions. And this is something that I didn't have anyone really explaining what to do. I had to figure it out intuitively initially, not knowing what else to do. I started working with a psychotherapist, which for many of us, this is a very important component of our healing journey. And but it took me so far. But intuitively, I had the sense that I needed to dive into the depth of all these. In my case, they were extraordinarily, excruciatingly painful emotions. And so, as I would dive into the depth of these emotions, and sometimes they were so excruciatingly painful, and I was consumed by them, it was incapacitating. But as I would continue to stay as fully present as I possibly could and breathe very softly and very deeply, at a certain point, even though it was excruciating, I'd get to this point where it would just break open and I could feel the pain literally just coming out of my body in waves. And then there would be these powerful emanations of warmth beginning to emerge from within. And so as I would do that, what would happen is experience acceptance and the self-love would follow suit. If we deny or suppress these emotions, if we numb ourselves out to them, if we push them away, then it locks in the anger or the feelings that we're stupid or we're defective or unlovable. And yet, the more that I was able to become more and more fully present
Mm-hmm.
to my authentic emotional responses in these moments. And a lot of times these are feelings, so many of us, it's like, I don't want to feel that. I don't want to go there. We're afraid that if we go there, that we'll never come out of it. and that it would somehow validate what the other person said or the way they're treating us. Actually, quite contrary. I found that the more I could go there, fully experience those feelings, be fully present with them, dive into the depth, breathing from the middle of what I felt, going to those places within my body where I felt those things. I continue to breathe from the depth of those feelings and move through them until I came out the other side. As I would move through these feelings, then the self-acceptance, the self-love and self-appreciation. That's how I came to this point. And it's such a crucial step, because if we can't go into these feelings, if we're not able to thoroughly process or digest them, they remain frozen within our bodies. And there's this profound disconnect where these feelings are operating apart from our conscious awakening awareness. And when these highly charged emotions, these parts of us that are, say, split off, and they operate basically out of whole separate neural tracts within the brain. They have their own thought processes, their own perception, their own worldview. Whereas as I brought myself fully into the depth of these feelings, breathing into them, digesting them, it facilitates an integration between these parts of ourselves. It brings about an alignment that would not happen otherwise. So we can't do it just intellectually. It's not solely an intellectual process. We have to merge, we have to become subjective with these deeply wounded parts of ourselves. And by being fully present with them, breathing with them, that's a big part of the process. But the fact that I also spent years training with a traditional Native American doctor, what they call medicine man, part of our training, we go alone into the mountains for 4 days and nights. We're not eating or drinking, no food, no water. And so going through this experience, I have this profound presence descend into my body. And sometimes it'd be a bit hallucinatory. I would have portions of my life, or specifically these really traumatic experiences, coming back. I'd be reliving these experiences, all the vivid sensory impressions, the emotions associated with those experiences. And that presence would be helping me to digest those lived experiences, all those highly charged emotions. And so those lived experiences and emotions, they'd be being transformed within me, and it'd be helping me to develop this new and healthier foundation from which I could relate, through which I could engage with other people. And so as I continue to take these steps, working with the practice I described, working with this profoundly powerful therapeutic intervention, then gradually my relationships, I was being transformed from within, and my relationships are being transformed. And there's more self-acceptance, self-love, self-appreciation. And so it's building this foundation. And also the fact that I spent years training with a master from China. These two different traditions from China, this Native American tradition, there's always this emphasis on you're continually building foundation. And so many of us, we carry these traumatic wounds, these wounds from all this dysfunction that we've grown up with. And so as we incorporate these practices and these interventions, we can transform ourselves. And gradually we develop, again, the self-appreciation, acceptance, and self-love. And as that happens, then as we are transformed, then we see that reflected back to us in the individuals we attract into our lives and the relationships that we cultivate with them.
Did you find that when you go to these non-Western, like Eastern and indigenous, medicine man and Native American principles or philosophies, one thing I noticed, I'm part Cherokee and Blackfoot, and one thing I've always felt is the kind of different mindset that's not a Western mindset. Like when you have these mindsets that are less maybe into just science based or certain dogma that you're taught, like not to be vulnerable, not
Mhm.
to embrace vulnerability, not to kind of go dead on against it. You kind of told to suppress it, kind of like a stoicism, where other philosophies that might not be from a Western point of view look at more holistic vision of the person, like spiritual, mental, body, heart, mind, environment. Does those things are given weight or given understanding that maybe from a Western perspective you don't have.
There's all these different cultures, whether it's our more modern day world that we live in, what I sometimes refer to as Wonder Bread culture, and these traditional ancient cultures. Now, I spent a lot of time in India, Sri Lanka, China, among Native Americans. Every culture has its beauty. There are certain insights, understandings that are prevalent, and then there's the lack thereof. And in this culture, we can be very much in our heads, and a lot of it's about ideas and concepts. But one thing I really appreciate, and this is where in the mental health profession, our psychotherapists and our psychiatrists, and there's a tremendous amount of depth and understanding that we didn't have before. And even within some of these ancient traditional cultures, there is a disconnect emotionally. There is, like you find in South Asia, a lot of these traditions, and there's this development spiritually and a lot of practices through which people would evolve. And yet they didn't understand a lot of the emotional component of her development. And even among Native Americans, there's a lack of understanding in this. And yet within these individuals within our mental health professions, again, have this profound insight. But then on the other hand, the people in our modern day world in the mental health professions may not have access to some of these extraordinarily powerful therapeutic interventions. So on one hand, we need the insight, we need the understanding. It's crucial. But we also need practice. You can't just, again, it's not just a mental process, and there are practices. Like I developed a whole series of intensive meditation practices. And at the time I was developing these practices, I had no awareness or understanding. I didn't even know it existed, the Buddhist mindfulness practices. So I was developing on my own a series of practices. So if a person's going through a devastating breakup, for instance, I may have them bring to their awareness their current or former partner where they're being jerked around emotionally. And I have them bring that partner into their awareness and notice how they're feeling in their physical body, the emotions, the physical sensations, dive into the depth of those emotions, breathing very softly and deeply. And that's critically important. It's going to help them to connect with those emotions, to access them, and begin to digest their authentic emotional responses. That's going to enable them to engage the deeper healing intelligence residing within their body and mind. And it's going to do a great deal to facilitate the healing. But in addition, there are again, the interventions. So within these ancient traditional cultures, there are traditions of these healers. There are individuals that possess various gifts of healing. And it's not like they go through 3 weekend workshops and assume the title of master healer. And it's very unfortunate. In our modern day culture, the new agey thing tends to trivialize everything with which it comes into contact. People going through a few weekend workshops, assuming the title of master healer. No, it's you go through years of intensive training. So you have these individuals where there's a transmission passed down. You have your mentor who would take on maybe one or just a few apprentices. And these individuals, such as myself, possess these gifts of healing. Where, and I know for me, it's working with people with physiological health challenges like respiratory or digestive disorders, people injured in automobile accidents, facilitating the healing of the physical body, but also facilitating the healing of these profoundly deep emotional wounds, the traumas people carry, these patterns people enact in their lives of abandonment, unrequited love. So there are the interventions. And then for me, another intervention, like I described, is when I go through the vision quest, the 4 days and nights alone in the mountains without food and water. So we need the combination of the understanding, that's, say, provided through a lot of these insights gained by psychotherapists and other people within the mental health profession. We need to incorporate the practices, specific kinds of meditation practices. We need interventions. Interventions could be deep tissue body work. It could be making use of those sensory deprivation flotation tanks. It could be working with the gifted healers such as myself. It could be like me, for instance. I go on the vision quest, as I described this process where I go out to fast the 4 days and nights alone in the mountains, and I have this profoundly powerful presence or force working with me during the vision quest to facilitate the healing of these traumatic wounds. Again, does all that make sense? All these different components that are involved in the healing process?
I think it sounds like it's a holistic process where it's an amalgamation of a lot of different things that are
It is.
Western or Eastern or indigenous. And it kind of
Mhm.
goes from the kind of perspective of like, holistic thinking. Like holistic thinking, you take pieces of multiple things, you're not as narrow minded. You're trying to solve some kind of problem, but you're not focused just on one potential solution. You're looking at there might be something that X could do or Y could do or Z could do, and maybe it's a combination of multiple things over a set time, and there's no like quick fix like 10 step, 12 step, 15 step. People want to today put things into like these little boxes, and I think they want to know that they can get it done. And sometimes it's the process. You have to each individual person might have a different issue, and it might have to come at it from multiple ways, and it might not be one solution fits all. I think a lot of times you have to kind of look at that individual and see where they're what the concern is, and try to figure out the best way to do it. And it might not be a quick fix. What I find, anything that is worthwhile usually doesn't happen super fast. And there's a tendency in today's society to want to do things so quickly and get immediate results. Now, I'm not sure if that's always possible.
Right. You articulated that very well, actually. And here again, the fact that I spent years training with this traditional Native American doctor. So I began to work with people on my own. Like initially, he would have me assisting him as he worked with various individuals. I was living with them on the Navajo reservation. And I was staying in a community called Ojo Amaria, if I pronounce it right. It was a Spanish name, but um, it was in this larger section. Was it Nanahinzat? It's a Navajo community that, and he would have me assisting him as he worked with individuals, but then gradually I began to work with people on my own. And I didn't know or understand very much in the beginning, but as I kept working with different individuals, I gained a lot of insight, understanding, and so there are myriad aspects to, whether someone's dealing with physiological health concerns. Some things are primarily physiological. Someone's injured in an automobile accident, but even if so, it's like, for instance, we all develop this kind of defensive armoring where over the course of our lives, we suffer there's even traumatic events, or there's like just a lot of just ongoing difficulties, challenges that we encounter in our work, in our relationships, and not really knowing how to deal with our own emotional wounding, how to cope with the stresses of everyday life, all the stress and the emotions. A lot of that just gets buried in the body. And so, say someone is injured in an automobile accident, or even if they suffer some catastrophic illness like cancer or stroke. And what will happen is it will, as a result of those physical health challenges, a lot of that defensive armor that they built up that enabled them to contain a lot of those stresses and the emotions is all that comes unraveled. Years and decades of all that stress and the emotion, it's all coming up and they feel overwhelmed, they're consumed by it. And so I have to, in working with these individuals, address the whole range, addressing the physiological health challenges like facilitating the healing of the physical injuries, or um, the repair in the physical body if they suffered the stroke, but at the same time, working with them to enable them to process that backlog of all these highly charged emotions, years of emotional backlog that's leaving them feeling overwhelmed, consumed by these emotions. And so, whatever the condition, and there are also times like, working with people like the frequency, the prevalence of tick-borne diseases, Lyme, anaplasmosis, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, these are becoming so much more prevalent. So I could help these individuals to some extent, but there's other means that they need to go through to the fact that they have this pathogen that's within their body. And so maybe there's certain supplements, or there's medicinal herbs, and even things like the Rife machine have been very effective for actually killing off the bacteria, or the spirochete, that is responsible for all these symptoms that they're experiencing. So we had to combine like the best of all the uh, most effective practices, interventions, and so on.
I'd like pillars and like legs of something. It's like if you just go into the mind when there's something wrong with the body, that's not going to solve it. If there's something kind of in the heart and the spirit, it's kind of like it goes again to that holistic solution. You got to look at the whole person, which is not just the mind. The mind's a big part of it, but a lot of times you have to dive into, like you said, the physiological, and they also, the mind, and then there's like the spirit and the heart, and those can be different, different solutions for different situations. So if you find people who have like patterns, and one pattern that was kind of written up in some of your examples was this kind of pattern of people who jumpstart relationships, and then they find themselves getting ghosted because they seem to jumpstart. And maybe you could talk about like if you see a pattern that causes a certain causal link, and then you try to figure out like for that particular pattern, well, what's your what's your kind of remedy, or multiple like ways to address that.
Right. Are you asking me what's my way
Yeah,
to address
yeah,
that?
yeah,
I think
yes.
that's going to depend so much on the individual. So and the specific issue that arises at any given time. So it's not a generalized one size fits all approach. So, and initially, for instance, say if I did have somebody that was suffering as a result of a stroke, or if they were injured in an automobile accident. And this person starts working with me. But then, as their body's healing, and in many instances, a lot of these individuals have elected to continue to work with me because they found that it was helping them to address different issues or different challenges in their life. And so as they're going along, maybe they meet somebody, their body's recovered, they're no longer suffering as a result of that injury that we started initially that we were addressing. But they meet someone and they're experiencing some challenges that are coming up in the relationship, or they thought they were connecting with someone and that person ghosts them. And there are times, because of we tend to attract people into our lives who reflect our emotional wounding, but it's not always the case that every person that you attract into your life is reflecting necessarily some emotional wounding. If you take ghosting, for instance, ghosting has become so prevalent. And this is just what happens if you, as you're out, you're meeting people, you connect, or maybe you happen to connect with somebody online through some dating app. It's quite likely you're going to end up being ghosted at some point, because this is what people do. If you're spending time in South Asia, as I have, as I said, in India or Sri Lanka, where I've spent a lot of times, you're probably going to get bitten by mosquitoes. And so you don't want to try to, like, okay, what does this mean? What did I do to attract this into my life? That would be ridiculous. It's silly. It's like, no,
Yeah,
these,
just you're saying it's very prevalent. Well,
it's
I think
prevalent.
because of modern society, yeah, you've got like a technique where people are maybe engaging with so many people. There's only so many people they can actually, keep in their circle because they try to weed it out. So if somebody's got a very wide, uh, you know, I don't know, address book, and then you thought because they maybe have a mask on and they're just happy and they seem to be very gregarious, and whether you might have interpreted that they like you, but maybe that's just the way the face they put on doesn't mean that they're trying to hurt you, but they could just be the kind of person that's got a very wide open, you know address book, like I said, and then they're not going to engage with everybody, even though they seem like at the party they would. They can't possibly do that, so you're gonna get ghosted.
Having spent so much time in New York City, for instance, and many people in the city, very short attention spans. You have so much coming at you, people living above, below, and on all sides of you. You're inundated. And then the fact that we spend all this time on social media, there's all these dating apps that create this sense of that we have just infinite choice of potential partners. And so what happens is, with all this overwhelming input, it's just too much. And it's also continually triggering the brain's dopamine reward cycle. And so what happens is, that's conditioning, it's wiring our brain so that we're skittering along the surface of reality, jumping from one thing or one person to experience to the next person and the next person, the next experience and the next distraction. And so there's a lack of depth.
Yeah, it's like the
And
honeymoon. You want the honeymoon to be constant, honeymoon every day, and so as soon as it's not the honeymoon, then you drop it.
we lose that continuity, and it discourages the processes of deep introspection. It causes us to, it facilitates a much more shallow very superficial surface level of awareness, and it discourages the deep level processing of our emotions. And because there's all this added continual bombardment of sensory input, there's more of a tendency to disconnect from our bodies, disconnect from our emotions. And so what happens is people have these experiences, and with that disconnect from the body and the emotions, it's so much harder for people to process emotionally, process their life experiences, their subsequent emotional responses, to be as connected to their body, as connected to their immediate experiences. And so, what I'll find that happens is a lot of times, especially in New York City, people can show up immediately in the moment, and it feels like they're present with you. But there's this very short attention span, and they can't sustain it. Again, there's a lack of
Mhm.
continuity. And so people can show up, and you feel like you have a connection, and like, wow, and but then the person is just gone.
Go Yeah.
And it could be a number of things. Maybe somebody else comes into the picture. Maybe something you said or did triggered them emotionally. And rather than processing it, if something felt a little uncomfortable, it's like, oh, delete, and you're ejected. And
I had a question about that though, because like if you're gonna have like a relationship that's evolves or sustainable or has any depth, as you say, if you get addicted to the surface level instant gratification,
mhm.
is it gonna make you less likely to be able to be in a long-term relationship because you don't have the tolerance for what happens in a natural relationship? It's going to be ebb and flow. It's not going to be perfect. And if you immediately retract, if anything doesn't go like a 99%, how is that going to ever work out?
I think for many people, it's diminishing their capacity to be for these relationships to form. Because when we're being rewired, when our brains are being rewired, and we're being conditioned to jump from one thing to another, the next person and situation, and the next exciting thing, and we're losing that ability to, the fact that you think of just the amount of time that we spend on our devices. And a lot of times, even if we want to get out there and we want that connection, the fact that people are less available, they're less engaged. And so, even if we want that connection, it's harder to find it. And we're not spending as much time out in public spaces. And if we want to meet somebody, we see somebody that we find attractive, we want to approach them. And, with the Me Too movement, and women have a lot of reason, there's a lot of badly behaving men who have done some horrible things. And these issues are finally being brought to the surface. But there's also the fact that a lot of men are even more afraid to approach because you don't want to be labeled as a
Yeah.
sexual predator.
They don't know how to approach. I think the problem is like they had a way they thought they should approach, coming from their
Mhm.
grandpa, coming from their uncle, coming from the past. And now that's been kind of like, well, that's probably not the right way to do it. Right. So then how do you do it? Where's the social etiquette and training for everybody to know, because I don't know if that's really being taught. Like, what is the proper etiquette in our society to connect in a way that's not offensive? You would think it's kind of, well, that's common sense. Well, sometimes common sense is not readily apparent to some people.
Yeah, and we don't really have it because these are things that we're not really taught. And the other thing that I want to add in is the number of men who have made an attempt to initiate and they've experienced these brutal rejections. And there's only so many times that you can do that unless you're able to
Your
numb
ego.
yourself and not take it personally. But when you
Yeah.
attempt to approach and you continually get shot down, and because we have these dating apps and because it's become less and less commonplace to just engage in public spaces or even in parties, or it's just a lot of men don't know how to approach. I think a lot of women have also become less comfortable being approached. One thing I liked about or have liked about spending time in Sri Lanka, there's still an element that I can be out. I could be traveling by train, or I can be just out in some village area or in town or wherever, and there's still a way in which you make eye contact and you end up
Conversation. Yeah.
smiling at each other. You talk, and there's a lot more introduction. So people are not quite as hooked into all the digital media and the apps and the distractions. So it's still easier to connect, but in the United States, especially where the digital forms of entertainment are so developed and they are so engaging. And so because of that, we spend less time interacting, and there needs to be that encouragement. Are all these platforms and dating apps and social media, news providers, everything, sim gaming, and all the digital mediums are the model is keep you on the platform and
Yeah.
consuming the media for as much time as possible, because the more time you spend on the platforms and you're consuming the content that they put out, the the more that these advertisers can promote their products, and so the platforms are generating more ad revenue, more ad dollars. And so it's purposefully designed, it's engineered to hook you and keep you on as long as possible and to keep you coming back. But all of us, this is so important. We need that engagement. So, and I know there's a lot of issues. There are people that these days don't even want to identify, I guess, non-binary, whatever, but whether you're man or woman or non-binary or whatever, let's be a little less hung up about it and just whoever you are and however you want to identify or not identify, but just get your ass out the door and talk with people, relate with people, have conversations. And even though it can be awkward and uncomfortable at times, if it triggers you emotionally, which it will, it's, well, when it does, well, what do you feel? And where are these feelings within your body? Get inside the feelings, breathe softly and deeply, be processing, be digesting these feelings, work through them, and make use of the therapeutic interventions. Whatever you do, deep tissue body work, work with the therapist, do deep tissue, no, do the sensory deprivation flotation tanks, do acupuncture. So practice, do intervention, whatever helps you to process your emotional responses, do the meditation again, like I described, and then keep engaging with people. You need to engage with people. And when you can, meet in person with these people, meet again. And if you meet someone, you have a positive, you enjoy the interaction, exchange contact information. And reach out, send a text, maybe an email, call that person. I guess calling is outmoded. To me, that seems silly. Just pick up the phone and call
People
or
are so
text,
scared. I
whatever.
think they're so security conscious. Yeah, that's why I think they like the veneer of the app because
Yeah.
they don't have to give up. It's kind of a level of vulnerability. Like I'm a creative person, right? I'm a musician,
Yeah.
and when you're a creative person, you have to be somewhat vulnerable to
Hmm.
do your art. And so you have to put, and then people will either hate it or not hate it. And so,
Hmm.
or engage on it, right? So I think a lot of people are scared to engage. They're scared to give up anything that will potentially make them vulnerable in any way. That, so they don't like to give out the number or the email. They like to go through the cover of a couple layers. And I
Right.
think that's where at some point, yeah, you could end up having to block that person, but not everybody in the world is gonna need to get blocked. So, you maybe have to kind of let go of the fear.
We can't just let go of it. We have to actually process it, move through it. And that's where that practice I was describing, where if it's triggering fear and anxiety, social anxiety, bring it to your awareness and drop into the depth of it and breathe into it and process it. But we need to be uh, engaging because there's so many ways that, and when we're hiding behind all these screens, there's a way in which we contract. It stunts our development. We're When we're not as socially engaged, we're not developing fully as human beings. It's like, again, our development is stunted. And so we need to make that concerted effort to get out there and engage and relate with people. And the other thing, we need to be able to respond. Now, sometimes it would be very frustrating for me in New York City because, and there was a time years ago where my mom and her husband at the time, they had adopted a dog, and my my mom's husband, when he passed away, and my mom wanted to get rid of the dog, and I just adored him, and I would come back for a period of time, and he and I, this dog, were so bonded. And but despite the fact that would making my best effort, I would be out and I would engage with women in the city. I'd start conversations, and I could tell in the moment that there was this rapport. And I could tell with somebody doesn't relate to me or is very guarded or dislikes me or something. It's like I just stopped talking. I could be mid-sentence. It's like, "Oh, that person doesn't like me. Okay, I'm done." That's it. And but there are
Mhm.
times where I would be having a conversation with a woman, and we'd get into these animated conversations, and there would be instances where it's like, maybe I'd have work scheduled, I'd have an appointment. I'd say, "Look, I have an appointment scheduled, I gotta go." And there were instances where the woman I'd be talking with, I wish she'd give me a hug or even a kiss on the cheek or something, and we'd be exchanging contact information, but I would send an email or text or leave a voice message, and I'd never hear back from them. And it was so typical in New York City. And a lot of times it's maybe they had a
Mm.
negative experience with some other man, or are their friends, or there's all these stories like, oh, you don't know, he could be a rapist or a murderer or a stalker or something like that. And
Yeah.
it's just this fear mentality. And and yet, on the other hand, like, I would be teaching classes on a weekly basis, and I'd work with men and women individually, and a lot of women that I worked with would be like, "Oh, I don't have a man in my life. I'm not meeting anyone." And, there were instances like, "Yeah, do you not see the part you're playing in that?" It's like, what about that? And I've had these conversations with some of these women that I'd worked with or that I was friends with. What about that guy who was talking with you last week? Why didn't you respond to his text? How about just even exchanging contact information if they didn't exchange the contact information? How do you know that individual wasn't the best match you would ever meet in your entire life? And if you don't respond, you're just blowing that opportunity. And I would see a lot of people in New York City, and they're getting older as they're getting up in their 40s and 50s and on, and they're just alone. They have no one in their life, and they're just isolated. And
Well,
a
they're
lot of
also
people,
looking
yeah,
for perfection. I mean, one of the
yeah,
things as an artist is we embrace the idea of the happy accident, which
mhm,
means sometimes you don't make it perfect. You go with
yeah,
something that's a little looser, a little more rough,
mhm,
not exactly really tied down, right? You kind of like, well, it's a little unruly. And it seems like some people are very scared of that. They're scared of that kind of flow state moment.
mhm,
And maybe they connected somebody with somebody in that flow state, but then they get scared of it and they don't dive in, like you said, to
mhm,
figure out why are they scared of that? Why are they scared of they had a really good moment with this individual,
yeah.
but they don't want to follow it because they're thinking either they could do better or it's that, oh, that can't be true, so I'm not even going to pursue it because that's like, boys, that's not even a real thing.
And a lot of people are just so used to being in these contracted states, or they have these limited notions of, okay, this is how you're supposed to meet someone and maybe be introduced by your friend, or now it's this limited model. Okay, you meet somebody through a dating app. And it's just retarded, because the best match you could meet in your entire life could be the person who's standing right next to you on the subway.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
never
that's
know, because, there are all kinds of highly educated professionals on the subway. There are people that have a heart of gold and all kinds of amazing attributes are standing in front of you in line as you're waiting to check out in the supermarket, are look choosing, picking out the right apples or artichokes or whatever in the produce section. And and it's important for us, it's imperative for us to be open to possibility, to tune into our body, to tune into to your senses. And one of the most profound things we can do in terms of our personal, interpersonal or spiritual development, and one of the mottos I go by is show up, pay attention, participate. And there are so many ways that a lot of us are in this hugely contracted state, but we need to just engage, pay attention to what's going on around us, sense in, and be willing to engage. And again, this is one of the reasons I like spending time in Sri Lanka and some other parts of the world where people are more open and present and receptive to what's going on around them. Because how, when you can engage and talk with people, and if you enjoy the conversation, if you feel good with the interaction, there is, I was doing classes on a weekly basis, and that came to an end with COVID, and I'm in a different stage of my work. And so I don't know that I'm going to go back to doing weekly classes. But as I'm working with people and as I'm going more online, but anyway, right before COVID, within a year's time, there were about 3 different women, for instance, that were crediting me with the fact that all of a sudden they have somebody in their life. And it was the same thing. I told them, like, look, you have opportunities all the time. And there are so many guys, for instance, that really want to have somebody in their life. And if you're just out, and if you're just make eye contact and smile, if you get a good feeling, and if you're still feeling good, engage them in conversation, and conversation's going well and you sense there's commonality, exchange contact information. And if you're still feeling good about the interaction, and message them, don't just wait for them, or if they do message you, respond to them. If you fail to respond, then there goes that opportunity, and you could continue being alone and meet again in some neutral public setting. Safety is an issue, obviously, So meet in a neutral public setting. And as you continue to talk and you see each other again and you have this ongoing interaction, this is how relationships are formed. But these three different women were crediting me with the fact that they met their partners, they got into a relationship, and one of the three got married to the guy. And so there are all these opportunities. And of course, not everything's going to work out, but we need to be able to show up. We need to have the experience. And as we go through these experiences, as we engage with people, it's through the experiences that we learn and we grow and we evolve. And oftentimes it leads to us forming attachments with individuals with whom we can have a very deep and meaningful and fulfilling relationship.
Yeah, I think communication seems to have been kind of a lost art in the digital age. Because I think human beings innately, before all this tech, they knew how to talk to each other. I think all
Better
human
than
beings,
now.
yeah, they had, well, even you look at the letters people used to write back in the 1700s.
Yeah.
You look at the poetry people used to read, and the communication. You read the excerpts of like you know speeches and letters, and that people would write to their loved ones during the wars, and it's like wow, it's like there's so much depth there. We
Mm-hmm.
kind of live in an age of like less depth, and I think
Mm-hmm.
you can bring that depth back if you don't hold on to your vulnerability like some kind of badge of honor. I think
Mm-hmm.
you're going to get not everything's going to be perfect, but
Mm-hmm.
I think some people are so scared of imperfect moments, they don't let them be, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you show up, then things happen. This podcast, I showed up. We're actually at episode like 1045,
Wow,
and
that's amazing.
if I only did this for certain metrics, I wouldn't be doing it. I do it because I get to talk to people around the world, and from without even knowing what's going to happen, I get tons of opportunities that just I wasn't even planning on things, and I get to have work on projects and do all just because you show up. It's that connection of actually talking to people and showing up and building up this Rolodex of people that I've talked to. It's like the oral tradition of human beings talking to each other is how we learn, how we connect, how we get into relationships. It's the whole thing. And so once people start to realize that, in that state, you might make mistakes. You might say something, well, we're human, but you get over it. You figure out how to figure it out. You dive into anything that you're scared of, and you don't stop. You keep on working at it.
That's so wonderful what you're saying, because you're just, in another way, you're reiterating what I was saying before, but you're just your own unique way of saying that, but it just reinforces the message that I've been communicating, that again, we need to show up, pay attention, and participate, because that's how we develop. If we fail to do so, we shrink, we contract, and we fail to develop. But the more that we can engage, and we're both doing so in our own unique ways, and the way you're describing, even though you're working online, the fact that you've done over 1,000 of these live stream podcasts, that you're interacting with all these people, the fact that you're a musician, you're getting out there on the world stage, you're making yourself vulnerable in a way, and you're addressing those vulnerabilities within yourself, and so that's facilitating growth. And so you're living what I'm saying. You're being an example that people
We
can
try,
emulate.
but
Mhm.
I think everybody can just try because I wasn't if I get it back to my background, which I don't go into it all the time, but like I was a very shy kid in
Mhm.
my student assembly when I was like I don't know, junior high school, I ran off the stage because I was so shy.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know how to handle it. But I became a musician and it got me more comfortable being on stage. And then eventually, I would play in the clarinet or playing keyboards. I started, getting more confident and then being able to present on stage. And then I figured out how to use this podcast platform and learned how to present that way. But it wasn't a natural thing for me. I had to grow
Mm-hmm.
into it. And sometimes you have to go right at what you're most scared of
Mm-hmm.
to get over it, to get into it. And I kind of dove into it. And I know maybe not everybody that's their path, but if you try, there's nothing wrong with it. Like, you can try and see where you go.
Even socially, just going back to what you just said here, it didn't come naturally to you. And yeah, you put yourself out there and you face that vulnerability. And so the same thing socially, as we see someone that we want to meet and we make ourselves vulnerable, we engage with that person, even if it's just saying hi, and we just find anything at all that we could talk about. I remember one of the most awkward beginnings that years ago, I was in the food cooperative in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I see this woman come in and she goes to the water dispenser for reversed osmosis water and starts filling up these containers. And I had this intuitive feeling, I need to talk with this woman. And there was fear on my part, and I had no idea what to say at all. And because of the fear, I allowed myself to become distracted. Div- I let myself become diverted, and I was talking with this other guy I knew who worked in the co-op, and then mid-sentence I stopped and I said, I need to go talk to this person. And I just turned around, I went back to still filling the water containers up. I had absolutely no idea what to say. And and then looking at her, I'm standing by her side, and I just said, "Are you Jewish?" And she gave me this really funny look, and it's like, "How did you know?" And I just said, "Your nose." And she starts laughing at me. And but that led to a conversation, and so we're talking for a while, and then we end up going for a walk, and it turned into a relationship. And we were together for some time. It wasn't you know, till death do us part, but it was a very important relationship in my life. And had I not listened to it, had not followed that prompting, I would have missed out.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
that's a really good example of what we've been talking about, but we've actually hit our hour mark.
Mhm.
And I want to thank you for being a guest on the Fam Electricos podcast. But we've been talking about how you can be more present and willing to engage. And you've been talking about social engagement of actually, getting outside the house, getting outside your smartphone. And if people want to dive into this even more, you click on one of the links we've had up. We're going to have those fully clickable when we're published on all the major platforms. We're on all the major podcast platforms where you can listen to or watch a podcast. We just been on YouTube and Twitch. We'll be later on Facebook. There was an issue with that, but we'll be on Facebook later. But thank you again for being on the Fam Electricos podcast. It was really illuminating, and I do appreciate your insights.
Thank you. Can I mention real quick, for anyone who wants to know more, you can go to my website, benoofana.com. My name's spelled. You can see that in the podcast. There's a free ebook, Getting Over Your Breakup.com. And if you want to talk with me, it's you can just book a call. And if you're facing challenges, it's refiningrelationships.com. So if you're struggling, I want to do what I can to be there for you.
Well, thank you again for being on the Fam Electricos podcast. I do appreciate it. Have a great night.
Thank you so much, Fathom. Very much enjoying engaging with you here.
Me too.